Welcome into PFF at Night. I am your host, Ari Meirov, joined here by Brad Spielberger and by our guest for the night, PFF's lead college analyst, Anthony Treash. And boy, do we have a lot to talk about. So let's jump right into it. Baker Mayfield has finally been traded. After months of talk and speculation, Baker is headed to the Panthers for a fifth-round pick in 2024. That could become a fourth-round pick based off his playing time. Carolina now has Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Matt Corral, and PJ Walker on their roster. Anthony, let me start off with you. The deal goes down. What were your thoughts on this deal for Carolina finally pulling the trigger, and what does this do for them?
I'm conflicted. I'm very conflicted. For one, I think the slander with Baker Mayfield has gone too far. I mean, people think he's legitimately the worst quarterback in the NFL. I think he can be a decent starter. We've seen him do it. I mean, heck, in 2020, he was a top 10 graded quarterback. I mean, he had a crazy run down the second half of the season where from week 7 on, he was the second highest graded quarterback. Finally got Cleveland to the postseason, which a lot of people didn't think would ever happen after the last couple of decades. But this last year, I mean, he was objectively bad. I mean, he was a horrendous quarterback. Everybody knows it. Baker himself knows it. His family probably would admit he did not play up to snuff. He was not that good. But a lot of that can be attributed to the injury. But then you look at the team he's really going to, and I just don't know if they're in a position to take on a quarterback like Baker Mayfield, who I think he may not be an elite one. I know I referenced that stat where second half of the season in 2020, he was an elite quarterback. I don't think he is an elite quarterback in general, right? I think within the right system, he can be, and that can be his ceiling. He can produce at a top 10 level with the right supporting cast, with the right play calling. You know, those are a lot of big ifs that need to go. Everything needs to go right around him. So I think he's kind of one that can be a top 10 quarterback in any given year, but he's more than likely a mid-tier starter. Not so much maybe the poor quarterback a lot of people thinks he is. But, you know, again, going back to this team, they're just not ready for a quarterback like this, right? I mean, the situation, while improving, better, you know, good receiving room, offensive line's getting there. I still think they're a ways away. And I think for anyone that should be absolutely elated they made this deal should be Matt Rule, because I think this gives him a little bit more time. Now he doesn't have to trot out Sam Darnold or Matt Corral. I think, you know, I look at, you know, from maybe an ownership perspective, I think I would be a little bit cautious or nervous. And I think they probably, you know, owner David Tepper probably like this deal, but I think just long-term, this doesn't make me want to buy stock, you know, in Carolina. I think they're still going to be kind of in that mid-tier range with a quarterback like Baker Mayfield. So we'll see how it plays out. I think it's probably a better move than some people would give him credit for, but I don't think this is going to take him over to a Super Bowl anytime soon.
No, Carolina really isn't giving up that much. And they've had discussions for several months, but it always came down to the money since Baker Mayfield had $18.8 million fully guaranteed. Brad, I guess break down for us, how did all the sides here work out the financials for this to finally go down today?
Yeah, so two components here and two things to analyze. First, I agree with you 100% in that Carolina really did not give up much, especially when you look at they traded a second, fourth, and a sixth-round pick for Sam Darnold last offseason and now give up a 2024, so a future conditional fifth that could become a fourth based on play time. I'm guessing because the incentives in Baker's new deal, the money he basically agreed to give up, that money could be recouped by some incentives that I'm guessing are not super hard to reach. But nevertheless, the Browns keep $10.5 million. The Panthers only acquire about $5 million in salary plus those incentives and give up, you know, really not much draft capital at all. I think it's crazy to not realize that is a great deal in a vacuum looking at just that acquisition. I mean, the former number 1 overall pick, as we discussed, has played at a high level, was hurt and not good last year, but their grades since 2018, Baker Mayfield's an 80 flat. Sam Darnold's a 59.5. I mean, this is a big upgrade at quarterback, however you want to look at it. I know Robbie Anderson may not be stoked about it, the wide receiver 2 in Carolina. I know Ben McAdoo, the offensive coordinator, had him as his quarterback 6 in the 2018 draft class. But nevertheless, in the NFL, he has been a better quarterback. And this is a dirt cheap 1-year flyer for a guy, look, that is as motivated as maybe any player in the NFL. They did upgrade this offensive line, and maybe they can find a way for both parties to benefit and maybe push for a wild card spot. But I agree with, at the end of the day, with Anthony, that it doesn't vault them into any sort of contending status, but it was a definite upgrade in a vacuum.
There's a scenario where the Browns could be paying $55.5 million to 2 quarterbacks this season who are not even playing for them, which is just insane to think about. But really the best part about this deal is that the Panthers are playing the Browns in week 1, which just makes a fantastic matchup. Shout out to the schedule makers who I guess forecasted this, but say what you want, Brad. You're right. Baker with a chip on his shoulder is the best version of Baker Mayfield, and we might get to see that in week 1. Anthony, circling back to you, the situation in Carolina is interesting because they have all these quarterbacks we mentioned. And as soon as this trade happens, there are people saying Sam Darnold had a great spring and it's going to be a competition. Newsflash to everyone, that is Carolina pushing that narrative out. The Panthers are, do you really believe this is going to be a competition, I guess? Or do you think Baker is coming in with him likely being the number 1 guy and something drastic has to happen for him not to be the starter?
I mean, it wouldn't be a true offseason if we didn't get some Sam Darnold love and hype in there, because it seems like we had that for years now. But I would be shocked if Sam Darnold's starting QB1 against Cleveland and Baker Mayfield's on the bench. I just don't foresee that happening. Like Brad said, I mean, the data speaks for itself. Even with that horrible season last year from Baker, he still has an 80.0 PFF grade, and Sam Darnold over 20 points, grading points behind him. So I think that can also translate to the practice field. I mean, I think there's enough out there to show, even for a coaching staff like Carolina and really any coaching staff, that Baker Mayfield is the better option there. You're still going to get some, flaws within there. I mean, he definitely has his clear-cut flaws in there. He's going to make some bad mistakes, get a little panicky sometimes when things don't necessarily go according to plan. But again, he's going to be a little bit more consistent than someone like Sam Darnold. So for me, I would still be shocked. Even though, like you said, maybe there's some love out there. He's had a good spring, but we've been hearing that for years now.
Yeah, I think it has to be that he's coming in with the intention of him being the guy when he walks in, and something drastic would have to happen for someone else to take it over from him. Brad, going back to you, because a lot of people are laughing at the Panthers, and they've made some moves and they haven't really had much winning over these last few years. It's been quarterback after quarterback. However, when looking at this offseason alone as a whole, you actually think they've been doing a pretty good job considering all their moves. Why is that?
Yeah, if you want to have an optimistic outlook and ignore the fact that, Baker Mayfield is first in the NFL in interceptions since 2018 with 56, and Sam Darnold is second with 52, and look at the rosier perception of what could happen this offseason. Look, Baker Mayfield is a guy that can make big plays downfield. Ben McAdoo is going to get the ball out of his hands quicker and maybe limit the ability for him to make mistakes. And they have a really good wide receiver duo in DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. You look at their offensive line, Bradley Bozeman at center was with the Ravens for a long time, a good player on a cheap deal. Austin Corbett coming over from the LA Rams on a solid deal to play right guard. And then they use a top 5 pick on Ike Ekwonu out of NC State at left tackle. They could have a vastly improved offensive line. And the defense wasn't really an issue for them last year, right? I mean, Brian Burns is a good young edge rusher. They have a lot of talent in the secondary. They did lose Stephon Gilmore, but retained a couple other pieces, added Xavier Woods at safety, added Matt Ioannidis, as a kept casualty on the interior, one of the dozen Temple players on this team. But nevertheless, there is, you look at the NFC South, it's not a super strong division outside of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If you're trying to create a best case scenario, I think there is an argument that their best case scenario is maybe, like I said, sneaking in as a wild card if everything breaks their way and they're healthy and all these things in a down NFC conference. I would say at the same time, the worst case scenario also is probably pretty bad as well.
Yeah, I just feel like their offseason alone with free agency, especially when you go back to last offseason, where in the first 10 minutes of free agency, they signed these 2 really not great offensive linemen. I think it was Cameron Irving, forgetting who the other one
Pat
was.
Elflein.
Yeah, they gave him multi-year deals with real guaranteed money. It just made no sense. This offseason, I feel like they've made some really decent moves to at least position the roster to be in a better shape, not panicking and taking Kenny Pickett at 6 and using the pick on Icky. A lot of things that are just smart decisions. And obviously it comes down to the quarterback. Everyone knows Matt Rule is on the hot seat coming into this year, but at least roster wise, compared to where they were to where they are now, it definitely feels like they are in a better spot. So now with Baker in Carolina, people are going to stop talking about him in Cleveland. That opens the door to the next quarterback conversation that will take over the news cycle for the next next weeks and maybe even months, and that is Jimmy Garoppolo. So I've had a hard time finding a logical landing spot here, especially now that Carolina is off the board. Going back to Anthony, do you see a logical landing spot here for Jimmy Garoppolo now that everyone is going to be talking about him with Baker off the board?
Nope. Do not at all. I mean, I think we're still a long ways away to getting this answer. Where Jimmy Garoppolo, where's he going to end up? I think it's going to be right up to, the final hours until week 1, right? And I think they're going to be holding out San Francisco. I mean, nobody wants to root for a quarterback to get injured, but if some quarterback just has a freak accident in camp or something of that nature in the preseason, then that team would probably become the front runner in the Jimmy Garoppolo sweepstakes, which is nobody right now. And that's where he would probably end up. But, I don't foresee that. You never want to say an injury is going to happen, but more than likely we'll probably get there. Hopefully clean bill of health for everybody. And I think he's going to end up getting released. And at that point, I think he'll be a little bit more of a hotter commodity. Save some cash for San Francisco, I believe, leading up to week 1. But then once that time comes, that all changes. So I think that's kind of the path we see. I just don't foresee any scenario where Jimmy Garoppolo is still on the start or still on the roster. I mean, this is Trey Lance's team. They invested so much into him last year. I mean, it would be hard not to give him the keys to the offense right now. And it would just create too much of a drama-filled atmosphere if Jimmy Garoppolo was still there with Trey Lance, especially if it's a rough couple of weeks to open up the year for him for the second-year sophomore quarterback. So, I think ultimately he will end up getting released. And I think at that point, I don't think he's probably going to be a starting quarterback, unless some team has, an injury come up at any point. But again, you never want to root for those things to happen.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are there on the same page with you on just not being able to find a spot that makes sense. And still, he has not started throwing yet since getting that shoulder surgery a few months ago. That is also playing a big factor here. Brad, any team here that could make sense for Jimmy Garoppolo? Or are we going to be waiting here and waiting?
Yeah, so I do think if he's released, not traded because they're both in the NFC West, but if he's released, I think Seattle would then probably kick the door, kick the tires, see if they can get him for a cheap 1-year flyer, play against your old team 2 games, come into a proven building and organization, have a great receiver duo, obviously, in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, at least as long as they have DK Metcalf for now. But the only team I think they maybe could make sense, funny enough, in a trade now is probably the Cleveland Browns. If, let's say, hypothetically, it comes down the pike that Watson's going to miss significant time. I think what's interesting here is the Browns ended up clearing about $8 million in cap space by moving on from Baker Mayfield. Jimmy Garoppolo's injury guarantee is $7.5 million for this season. They're not going to take on his entire $24 million salary, even though they do lead the NFL now with about $50 million in cap space. They need to carry that over to be able to eat some of, Watson's salary in 2023 and Myles Garrett and some of these big contracts they have. But maybe they would say, look, it's a net even. We'll also maybe not part ways with top end draft capital at this point because there's not a lot of leverage in San Francisco's favor, just like Cleveland had zero leverage in their trade and got nothing essentially. So funny enough, that might be the only option at this point outside of a cut, like Anthony said.
I feel like all that was missing in your answer, Brad, is you trying to mimic Brian Windhorst while giving your explanation there, because it would have been perfect. But yeah, that's the only thing that could make sense. If Deshaun gets a full year suspension, are they rolling with Brissett for a full year? Or do they try to bring in Jimmy on an adjusted contract and say, you're our quarterback for this year on the stacked roster, and let's go with that? It's definitely one to at least think about, but we're still waiting on the Watson discipline, which might take another week or 2. All right, let's shift over to Washington, where they made a big quarterback move this offseason. They acquired Carson Wentz. He's their quarterback. Today, they officially announced their extension with star wide receiver Terry McLaurin. And if anybody watched it, you can immediately tell why it was so important to get him back in the building, not just because of the great player that he is, but also just how he talks about the organization and really the leader he's become there for that team. But looking at this Washington team as a whole, where do you guys think they are? Chase Young is coming back. Carson Wentz is an upgrade from what they had last year. Anthony, can this Washington team, which won the NFC East a couple years ago, not a great NFC East, but they won it, could they actually be relevant and make some noise in this division this year?
Maybe they get a few upset wins, but I don't foresee them doing anything of, major significance. I would still be pretty surprised if they were, a wild card team in the end. Just looking at this team, like you said, it is an upgrade, right, over Taylor Heineke, but a modest one. I mean, Carson Wentz, I believe, was 21st in PFF grade last year. Taylor Heineke was 29th. I mean, it's splitting hairs here. We're talking about a poor starter and a low tier starter. And, I think with this team, I mentioned at the top, they could upset some teams because they have a quarterback who is notorious for being just incredibly volatile, right? I mean, I still go back to last year. One of the greatest performances I saw at the quarterback position was from Carson Wentz against Houston early on in the year. I think he had like a 94 PFF grade for the game, one of the best of the year. But then one of the worst, that New England game, he had like a 26.7 pass grade. It was horrendous. I mean, that's just who Carson Wentz is. I mean, he's very inconsistent with his decision making. I mean, the mechanics have always been an issue with him, leading to inaccurate throws. I mean, only half of his non-screen attempts were accurate last year. I mean, that's a very low number, for NFL standards there. So, looking at this team, maybe they kind of have some surprise wins every once in a while, but I don't think they're going to be anything significant. And, Terry McLaurin, it's very interesting because I really don't think we know what Terry McLaurin's type of ceiling is, because he's had bad quarterback play. I mean, it's interesting. Last year, I think one of my favorite stats of the year was just what he did from a contested catch standpoint. Right. Terry McLaurin. I mean, that's not, typically you think, wow, this guy had a lot of contested targets. He must not be able to separate very well. In Terry McLaurin's case, that's not true. It's just he was left out to dry so many times by the quarterback where he had to go out there and, make up for just bad throws on the ball. And, contested catches, he'll admit, was never a strength of his game, but he worked on it and he made it a strength because he had to, because the quarterback play has just always been bad. And so, I just think Terry McLaurin's a great player, obviously very valuable to that team on and off the field, but ultimately he can only do so much for him, and you have to go back to the quarterback position. And I'm just not very confident in Carson Wentz really, taking him to that next level to even a playoff team.
Carson Wentz and this Washington team will open up the season in Jacksonville, where it ended for Carson Wentz last year. So a visit back there where it was just an utter disaster. But really, the NFC East, it's one of my favorite stats, but they've gone 17 consecutive years that the defending NFC East champions did not repeat the next year. Brad, any thoughts on this Washington team as they enter year number 3 on the Ron Rivera?
Yeah, I've already kind of put this out there a little bit, so I guess I got to go full tilt. I think I'm the biggest Washington Commanders believer in the business, and it's probably a dumb position to take, but I am a believer in this roster. You look at some of the guys that are getting back from injury, although it does sound like Chase Young's injury was a specifically bad ACL tear. I read he had to do a skin graft or take cartilage or tissue from another part of his body and bring it over. So not a great injury there, but nevertheless, we think about that team as a great edge rush unit. They actually had our second lowest graded edge unit in the NFL last year. You then look at, I like to oftentimes look at free agents that kind of don't play their first year and then provide some extra boost the following year. I've talked about DJ Reader on the show before and how he kind of missed so much time in Cincinnati and then was almost like another free agent on top of Trey Hendrickson last year. Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson are basically both debuting for this offense this year. Terry McLaurin's going to fly out and start working with Carson Wentz, it sounds like, this week. So there are a lot of signs to point to. I like the trenches on both sides of the ball. I think they have talent on both sides of the ball. But again, the potential for disaster is probably high, but I would not be shocked if this team sneaks in as a wild card in the NFC, in part because I do not think it's a good conference and I don't think it's a good NFC East division. But, I'm fully prepared for this to look like a very dumb take in a couple months.
Well, the NFC East is always a roller coaster. Every single year, you expect to see some crazy rides with all 4 of those teams, whether it's the quarterback play, the coaching, the players, whatever it is. There's something that goes on over there, which makes the internet go crazy. I think we'll probably have it again this year, somewhere there in that division. Let's segue now to the franchise tag deadline, which is rapidly coming up. It's in under 10 days, July 15th, which is a Friday this year. There are 4 names we're keeping an eye on right now, and that is Jesse Bates in Cincinnati, Orlando Brown in Kansas City, Dalton Schultz in Dallas, and then Mike Gesicki in Miami. Brad, I'll start with you on this one. Are you expecting any long-term deals to get done in these next 9 to 10 days before the deadline finally hits?
I would put the odds of Orlando Brown Jr., the left tackle for the Kansas City Chiefs, far above the rest of the guys. I think he's the only one that I would right now say I expect an extension as opposed to not expect an extension. Obviously, things can change at the last minute. We've seen that almost every year. But, you look at the Bengals, they seem like they have in some ways already moved on with Daxton Hill and are preparing to pay some of the young guys they have on their roster. And then the tight end position is just tough because, frankly, if I was an agent for Dalton Schultz or Mike Gesicki in Miami, I probably would be asking for more than George Kittle. I know that people are going to hear that and think I'm saying they're better than them. That's not what I'm saying. That's not how markets work. That's not how contracts work. They frankly do deserve to change that to tight end market. But then I also see from the team perspective them saying, why would we pay you more than George Kittle? So I just don't see those three deals getting done at all. Whereas with Orlando Brown, he has all the leverage in the world. He clearly knows that. The Chiefs can't have this all-in offseason last year and signing Joe Thuney to the highest paid guard deal ever and drafting their center and their right guard, doing all these things to fix the offensive line, which of course culminated with the trade for Orlando Brown, and then have maybe him holding out or not being happy for the season. I think they just have to get a deal done.
Yeah, and Brown actually just recently hired an agent, so there's been hope that will jumpstart talks there. They are in negotiations, and they are hopeful to get something done. Anthony, I want to ask you in particular about Jesse Bates, because he really is the heart and soul of that defense, and he's player that they drafted, homegrown player, but it seems like they've been far apart for over a year now. We got to see him this past weekend at a UFC event with Joe Burrow, and Burrow has been very vocal about getting him back. But he's made it clear that I'm not playing under the franchise tag. That sometimes is a leverage play, but maybe it's real. What do you think about Jesse Bates and what he means there in Cincinnati?
It's interesting because I think we could see the franchise quarterback, Joe Burrow, maybe step in and say, hey, fellas, I like Jesse Bates. We all love Jesse Bates. We want Jesse Bates. You need to sign him. And so I think we're going to have a very interesting scenario play out here. And, from a, on-field perspective, Jesse Bates, of course, he's been great. I don't think anybody's arguing that he's been top 10 graded safety over the last couple of years, one of the 10 most valuable players at the position in that time span. I mean, heck, in the postseason, it's one of the highest graded defensive backs in the entire playoffs with an elite PFF grade, very instrumental piece to getting to the Super Bowl for Cincinnati. So, I mean, he is one of the best players at the position. He can be at that level. But, Cincinnati, like you said, they seem pretty content with where they're at. They could move on from Dak or move on, very comfortable with Daxton Hill. Me personally, I think that's kind of a larger bet to make, but, we'll see what comes to fruition because I don't think we would see, a very happy, Cincinnati Bengals team from the player perspective with the front office if Jesse Bates is not on the field for him. If he's on the franchise tag and maybe it's a leverage play, but if he doesn't, end up playing, which you rarely see in these scenarios, then I think you can have a very, interesting dynamic there. But, for a team that just went to the Super Bowl, reigning AFC champions, I'm not sure you really want to break that continuity and create some problems there. So it's a lot of interesting stuff that could be stirring up in Cincinnati. And I think if he doesn't get a long-term extension, that's something to kind of monitor there.
No, it definitely is. It's not even getting that much attention when it should. I mean, having an unhappy team leader going into this season after the year they just had might not be the smartest thing to do. And obviously the safety market just reset a couple of weeks ago with Minkah Fitzpatrick. So the price has only gone up. I think it's reset 3 separate times ever since Jesse Bates became eligible for an extension with Simmons, Adams, and then now with Fitzpatrick, and they have not gotten any deal done. Again, they have 10 more days. Let me just mention one thing about Dalton Schultz and the Cowboys. Cowboys historically have for some reason always taken the franchise tag stuff to the final day, whether it was Des Bryant, DeMarcus Lawrence and Dak Prescott. When they didn't get a deal the first time, they were talking until the final day. They've had, even going back to like 2008 and 2012, I think it was Anthony Spencer, Ken Hamlin, final day they get a deal done. They always take it to the final minute. So the talks of Dalton Schultz have been on and off. If it gets done or if it doesn't, I think those talks are going to go down to the final minute on July 15, which again is on a Friday this year. All right, let's segue to this now. Anthony, you are our lead college analyst here. So I wanted to throw in a bit of a rookie element or rookie topic here. Are there any non-first round picks from this past year's draft who you think could make a big impact in their first year this year for their team. We've had the OTAs, we've had the rookie mini camps, we've heard coaches talking about all these guys. Is there a player you believe could have a major impact for his team in year one? Who is that guy?
Yeah, it kind of feels like cheating a little bit because I'm going to go with someone that was just a few picks away from being a first rounder. I'm going to go with Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, formerly of North Dakota State. And, it's funny. I know all these college guys across the country, all throughout the FBS, even the FCS. Christian Watson, for me, he was kind of an afterthought. I didn't think he would surprise me as much as he did when I was down in Mobile for the Senior Bowl. I mean, you look at him on the field, and I was like, damn, this guy, he can play. I think he was one of the better players in attendance. You saw just the freakishness that he is from an athletic perspective. 6'4", just over 200 pounds. He had one of the best combines, I think, in history, with what he did there in Indianapolis a month after, lighting up the Senior Bowl. And, you go back to what he did at North Dakota State. It's a run first offense, right? And, strength of competition, it's as bad as it gets, right? It's hard to evaluate him when you're going up against some guys that are probably going to be working in an accounting firm a year later. So, but you did see just the growth, I thought, throughout the season. A lot of people knocked him in the pre-draft process for being a raw player, and he is a raw player, still is. But I thought the fact that he showed growth throughout the season and even down to Mobile made me confident that, maybe he can be something, in the NFL sooner than expected, just from a learning perspective. And even in Green Bay, where they're lacking dynamic weapons, he could get scheme touches in his hand. Like I said, he's an athletic freak. And so he's kind of one from a non-first round perspective that I think could make an impact soon, or a larger impact than some people think. And I would count out Romeo Doubs too. Also a day 3 pick for Green Bay, Nevada wide receiver. I think he's number 1 in deep receiving touchdowns over the last couple of years. And as we know, there's no MVS in Green Bay anymore. Maybe he could fill in that role. So I think those two names, I'm going to package them together. I think they could surprise some people.
Well, the Packers could definitely use that help after losing Devontae Adams and MVS this offseason. So we'll keep an eye on both those guys. Brad, who do you have as a rookie, non-first round pick who could make an impact in year one?
I guess I'm also cheating because I think he was the 36th overall pick, so barely missed the first round. But it's Arnold Ebiketie with the Atlanta Falcons. I mentioned how Washington struggled with their edge rush group. No one was even close to as bad as the Atlanta Falcons edge defenders last year. They had 67 quarterback pressures. The next lowest was 94. They had 8.5 total sacks as an entire edge rush group. The next lowest, I want to say, was 16.5. And then they had a 50.9 overall grade as a group, by far the lowest again. So he enters the fold, transferred from Temple to Penn State, played just 1 year last year, but the step up in competition, still earned a 90.5 pass rush grade, had a 22.9% pass rush win rate in college football, both elite marks across the country. I think it's not so much that he's going to, they're going to win a bunch of games, but just no team needed a position and a player at a position more than I think Atlanta needed some juice off the edge to help with Grady Jarrett on the interior. And I think he's a guy that maybe doesn't have the elite intangible or the elite kind of athleticism and traits to maybe become a top end guy, but I think a guy that's pretty polished and could make an impact right away as a rookie.
Yep, and the Falcons actually made another move on the defensive line today, adding Eddie Goldman to that defensive line as well. Some people are calling them the Atlanta Bears with all their former Bears that they're adding over there. But just 28 years old, and he started over 70 games in his career, definitely made an impact there in Chicago, and now joins the Falcons. My pick here quickly, I have the Steelers' second-round wide receiver in George Pickens. Every year there are those receivers, and it could be Watson, like you mentioned, but there's receivers don't go in round 1, who go in round 2, 3, 4, who pop off, right? Last year was Amon-Ra St. Brown. We've had T. Higgins and McLaurin and DK and AJ and all those guys who went after round 1. With Pickens, there were some injuries and there were some maturity problems, which is in part why he slipped, but he can really go up and just get the football for his size at 6'3". He's got pretty crisp route running. His quarterback play at Georgia was nothing to really be proud of. And then there's just the Steelers element of being able to find receivers, right? Kevin Goldberg knows how to do this, and he's done it for so many years outside of round 1. Claypool, Deontay Johnson, Juju, Martavis Bryant, Emmanuel Sanders, Antonio Brown, Mike Wallace, the list goes on and on. I think George Pickens is next up to join that great list in Pittsburgh with a rookie quarterback in Kenny Pickett and or Mitchell Trubisky here in his rookie year. Last one here before we wrap up, a little bit of a fun topic. NBA free agency was going on last week. Some might argue their offseason is better than their regular season because it really is pretty fun. But yeah, there's a lot going on, a lot of big trades, trade requests, big signings, a lot of money being thrown around. What I wanted to ask you guys, is there anything from the NBA offseason that you wonder if it's ever going to happen in the NFL? Anything that really stick out to you? Let me start with Brad.
Yeah, I guess I would say one thing that just came to mind is that I still think we don't see a lot of player-for-player trades in the NFL. The NBA, the way it's set up, you have to, right? Because you have to match salaries. And so if you want to send out a certain amount, you have to then recoup a certain amount from the other team. We still see, where there are rumblings that Baker Mayfield can maybe have been traded for Robbie Anderson, from the Carolina Panthers. And we still just don't see a lot of player-for-player movement. Maybe that's the next thing we start to see as teams kind of balance. Maybe we don't want to draft pick. We'd rather bring in a player that we need more than they need. And he's the number 4 guy on their depth chart, number 2 on our depth chart. Maybe that's something we start to see more of going forward.
Definitely an interesting thought there. I mean, the NBA definitely has a lot of it because the way they're capping everything is much different than the NFL. Anything stick out to you, Anthony, when you saw NBA free agency going on this past week?
Yeah, just looking at the NFL free agency and, really just the NFL in general over the last couple of years. I mean, the NBA, like you said, the off seasons are always awesome. They're drama filled. These star players change teams left and right. You never know who's going to end up where. You wait for those Woj bombs now, GM bombs. But, you see all these star players move. The NFL is kind of doing the same thing. And I think we're only really getting started there. And when we saw Tyreek Hill do it, we've seen many others do it. Deebo Samuel, of course, he's looking like he's going to be in San Francisco. But he was very unhappy and he wanted out. I mean, you have some other ones there, A.J. Brown. I mean, a lot of these players, if they're just not happy with the situation, they want more money. I think they're going to be more willing to demand a trade and move teams. I think they're more comfortable with that. So, I think we're just, really at the beginning of maybe the NFL off seasons picking up more steam and really kind of being this NBA type of off seasons, just with the way social media is too and everything. I think it's just going to be, something to watch and it's going to make the months. For us, the months of, February, March, and April have always been awesome. We've loved them, but I think they're even going to be more, exciting in the coming years.
No, definitely. I think the only thing that stuck out to me is whenever you see a Kevin Durant with 4 years left under contract, demand a trade, and the team reaction is like, okay, we'll look around and trade you. Like in the NFL, if like Deshaun Watson did it when he was with Houston, he requested a trade before all the off-field stuff happened. But the reaction by the front office is like, no, we're not trading you. The NBA is like, okay, we'll look around and look to trade you. I was like, I wonder if it's ever going to happen in the NFL where it's not like 2 years, 1 year left on my contract, where it's like 3-4 years and a player makes a demand and the team listens. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think the NFL is more, there's a lot of leverage when it comes to these teams, especially with the franchise tag and all of that. But it's fascinating to see how these guys are demanding trades with multiple years left on their contract. And the teams are just like, all right, we'll trade you. It's quite fascinating to see. And I think everyone is watching what happens with Kevin Durant ultimately there in Brooklyn. All right, that will do it here for PFF at Night. Make sure to check out pff.com for all your news, analysis, data, and much more. So much great content and tools on there. It really is endless. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. It is at MySportsUpdate. Brad, it is PFF_Brad. And Anthony, it is at PFF_Anthony. We will be back on Monday with more NFL coverage, and it will be probably a lot more stuff going on in the NFL as things heat up around the National Football League. See you then.